Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going through 25 Mortal Kombat games you can actually play on Nintendo Switch right now. Starting off the list at number 1 is Mortal Kombat Arcade. And if you want to understand where this entire franchise began, this is the version to experience first. The Legacy Collection on Switch gives you the original arcade build in all its glory. Digitized fighters, iconic blood code, and everything. This is the game that literally sparked a congressional hearing over video game violence and started a cultural conversation that changed the gaming industry forever. Playing it today still holds up surprisingly well. Coming in at number 2, the SNES port of Mortal Kombat is a fascinating piece of gaming history on its own. Unlike the Genesis version, the original SNES release shipped with the blood censored, which actually made it controversial among fans at the time. Thanks to the Legacy Collection now available on Switch, you can play this exact version and compare it directly to the other ports. It is a perfect case study in how platform politics shaped what players actually received back in the early 90s. Right behind that, at number 3, is the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat, and this one has a legendary reputation for a very specific reason. Sega allowed the blood to stay in with a simple button code, which made the Genesis port massively popular and gave Sega a huge win in the console wars. Now playable on Switch through the Legacy Collection, this version lets you experience exactly why so many kids begged their parents for the Sega instead of the Super Nintendo back in 1993. Number 4 brings us to the Game Boy version of Mortal Kombat, and honestly, the fact that this exists at all is still kind of wild. Getting a fighting game like this onto a handheld in 1992 was a technical achievement, even if the result was a pretty stripped-down experience. What makes it worth checking out today is purely the novelty and the historical context. The Legacy Collection on Switch preserves it faithfully, and it is genuinely interesting to see how developers handled the limitations of that era. Landing at number 5 is Mortal Kombat 2 in its arcade form, and this is where the series really found its identity and started pulling ahead of the competition. The roster expanded, the fatalities got more creative and outrageous, and the gameplay felt noticeably tighter than the original. Many longtime fans still consider this one the definitive classic MK experience. Playing the original arcade build through the Legacy Collection on Switch is the cleanest way to experience this version today. Checking in at number 7 is the Genesis port of Mortal Kombat 2, and this version is a strong conversion that holds its own against the SNES release. Both home ports of MK2 were well received at the time, and the Genesis version maintains the fast pace and feel of the arcade build nicely. For fans who grew up on Sega hardware, this is going to feel very familiar and a little nostalgic. The Legacy Collection on Nintendo Switch packages all of these ports together, so you can easily go back and forth between them. Number 8 on the list is Mortal Kombat 3 in its original arcade version, and this entry made some bold changes that divided the fanbase pretty hard when it launched. The run button was brand new, the combo system got a serious overhaul, and several fan favorites like Scorpion and Johnny Cage were left out of the roster entirely. Despite the controversy it generated, MK3 pushed the series forward mechanically in meaningful ways. Playing the arcade build on Switch through the Legacy Collection gives you the purest version of that experience. Taking spot number 9 is the SNES version of Mortal Kombat 3, which was a genuinely impressive home port for its time. The transition from arcade hardware to the Super Nintendo was handled decently well, and it captured most of what made the arcade version interesting. Younger players today might not fully appreciate how technically challenging these conversions were back then, but for anyone who played MK3 on SNES as a kid, this version in the Legacy Collection on Switch is going to hit a real nostalgia nerve. At number 10, we have Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 in its arcade form, and this was essentially Midway correcting the mistakes of the base MK3 release. They brought back beloved characters, balanced the roster significantly, and added enough content to make it feel like the game MK3 should have been from the start. For a lot of fans, this is actually the definitive classic-era Mortal Kombat experience. Having this arcade build accessible on Switch through the Legacy Collection is a genuine treat. Sitting at number 11 is something genuinely rare, the WaveNet arcade version of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, and this is a version that hadn't been playable anywhere since 1997. WaveNet was an early online system that connected arcades together for competitive play, and this specific build was developed around that setup. The fact that Digital Eclipse managed to preserve and include this version in the Legacy Collection on Switch is extraordinary from a gaming history standpoint alone, and makes it one of the most unique inclusions in the entire package. Coming in at number 12 is the SNES version of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which brought the expanded roster and polished gameplay of the Ultimate update to home players at the time. It was a meaningful upgrade over the base MK3 SNES release, and fans responded positively to finally having the full character roster available at home. With the Legacy Collection now on Switch, you can fire up the specific port and experience the classic era of MK in one of its most complete home console forms from that generation. Number 13 is Mortal Kombat Trilogy, the most content-stuffed entry in the classic era of the franchise. This game pulled together virtually every character from the first 3 games, including secret and boss fighters, giving players a massive roster to work with. The PlayStation version included in the Legacy Collection on Switch is the most complete way to experience it today. If you ever wanted to play as Goro, Kintaro, Motaro, or Shao Kahn as a regular fighter, this is the game that made that possible. Stepping into spot 14 is Mortal Kombat 4, which holds the distinction of being the first fully 3D entry in the series. The jump to 3-dimensional graphics was a major shift for Mortal Kombat, and while the transition was a bit rough around the edges, it was a significant moment in the franchise history. The arcade version included in the Legacy Collection on Switch lets you revisit this pivotal entry without needing original hardware. Weapon combat was introduced here, and while it was not perfect, it laid some interesting groundwork for future games. At number 15, we have Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero, which is genuinely one of the most unexpected inclusions in the entire Legacy Collection. This was a side-scrolling action-adventure spin-off from 1997, built around Sub-Zero as the main character, and it had been completely unavailable for decades before the Legacy Collection brought it back. It is absolutely rough by modern standards, but it has a cult following, and its story actually expands the lore in interesting ways. On Switch, it is playable right now, and worth experiencing just for how unusual it is. Number 16 is Mortal Kombat Special Forces, and similarly to Mythologies, this is another long unavailable spin-off that the Legacy Collection rescued from obscurity. This one followed Major Jackson Briggs, and it was an action game rather than a traditional fighter. Special Forces is historically seen as one of the weaker entries in the franchise, and even the developers were not entirely happy with it at launch. But having it accessible on Switch through the Legacy Collection is valuable for completionists and for anyone interested in the full story of how the Mortal Kombat brand tried to expand beyond fighting games. Hitting number 17 is Mortal Kombat Advance, the Game Boy Advance port of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, and this version has an interesting reputation in the MK community. It brought a fairly robust fighting game to handheld hardware, with a decent-sized roster and solid core gameplay, even if some compromises had to be made for the platform. The Legacy Collection on Switch preserves this version properly, and it is a fun piece of portable gaming history. For Switch players, it is kind of poetic that an old handheld MK port is now playable on a modern handheld console. Coming in at number 18 is Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance on Game Boy Advance, which was a surprisingly competent handheld adaptation of the then-current console release. Deadly Alliance on home consoles was considered a solid entry, and the GBA version captured enough of what made it work to be worth playing. The Legacy Collection on Switch includes this GBA build, and it holds up reasonably well as a portable fighter even today. It is one of those ports that quietly impressed people at the time and still deserves a bit of credit for what it pulled off on that hardware. At number 19 is Mortal Kombat Tournament Edition on Game Boy Advance, which was a follow-up to the GBA Deadly Alliance port with an expanded roster, including additional fighters from the Deadly Alliance DLC. It was released exclusively on Game Boy Advance and gave handheld players access to a wider selection of characters. Now part of the Legacy Collection on Switch, this version rounds out the handheld chapter of classic Mortal Kombat history quite nicely. It is a modest but solid portable fighting game and an important piece of the full franchise timeline. Number 20 is Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection itself, and it earns its own spot on this list because as a package, it is more than just a collection of old ROMs. Digital Eclipse built an interactive documentary into the game, featuring exclusive interviews with Ed Boon, John Tobias, Dan Forden, John Vogel, and dozens of others who made these games. There are archival materials, developer stories, and historical context that make the collection feel like a museum piece as much as a game compilation. On Switch, it is one of the most comprehensive gaming preservation projects ever released. Landing at 21 is Mortal Kombat 11, the game that set a new benchmark for what a fighting game could look like on Nintendo Switch. The cinematic story mode, the deep custom character variation system, and the sheer quantity of content packed into this release made it one of the best fighters available on the platform. Towers of Time gave players an almost endless stream of challenges to work through, and the roster of classic and new characters is excellent. It remains one of the most recommended fighting games on the eShop, even years after its release. At number 22 is Mortal Kombat 11 Ultimate, which is the definitive way to experience everything MK11 has to offer in one package. It bundles the base game, the Combat Pack 1, the Aftermath expansion, and Combat Pack 2 together with the full 37-fighter roster, including Mylena, Rain, Rambo, and the guest characters like Terminator, Joker, Spawn, and RoboCop. If you are only going to pick up one version of MK11 on Switch, Ultimate is clearly the one to get. The value in this package is genuinely hard to beat for what it delivers. Coming in at number 23 is Mortal Kombat 11 Aftermath, the story expansion that added a completely new chapter to the already acclaimed main campaign. Aftermath focused on Fujin, Shiva, and a very unexpected guest appearance that fans went absolutely wild for at the time. It fleshed out the MK11 narrative in a meaningful way and added 3 new playable characters plus a new map. On Switch, the expansion integrates directly into the main game, and the cinematic quality of the storytelling continues to stand out even compared to much newer releases. At number 24, we have Mortal Kombat 1, the 2023 reboot that reset the entire franchise timeline and introduced the cameo fighter system as a major new mechanic. This entry divided opinion at launch, partly due to the Switch port performance, but consistent updates, and especially the Switch 2 version running at 60 frames per second, have dramatically improved the experience. The roster is strong, the story is ambitious, and the invasion mode gives players a surprising amount of single-player content to work through. It is a genuinely fresh start for the franchise. Rounding out the list at number 25 is Mortal Kombat 1 Chaos Reigns, the expansion that extended the MK1 story and added new fighters, cameo characters, and continued the narrative threads of the main game. It brought significant additional content to a game that was already packed with modes and deepened the new timeline lore in exciting ways. For anyone already invested in the MK1 story on Switch, this expansion is an essential addition that makes the whole package feel even more complete. A strong finish to a list full of games that cover the entire history of the franchise.